Alright, hey guys, and welcome to another Blender tutorial. Today we're going to be just talking a little bit about the Cycles renderer and how to create realistic DOF. Now, DOF is depth of field. Some people call it depth of focus or distance of field, but it is properly known as, and of course known as in Cycles, depth of field. Depth of field is when it's basically how far your camera can see on either end of its focus distance. So, in this image you can see on screen right now, the 2 is the focus object, and the 1 and the 3 are somewhat blurred out based on their distance relative to the camera. Now, this effect can only be achieved in the Blender internal renderer through the use of nodes. But in Cycles, we can actually calculate this directly through the camera and don't even need to use nodes. This makes the post-processing a little bit easier. It can also hinder us a little bit, but it is a more realistic method for creating DOF, and it automatically does everything for you. So you don't have to hook anything up other than setting up a few default options. So I'm going to press Z here so we can see what this scene looks like in wireframe mode. And you can see this is a giant plane. There's just 2 light sources, a sun and a point light, our camera here, and then our 3 numbers, and our 2 is the number it's focused on. You can see that here by the yellow line, this yellow T, lowercase t, I guess, or just yellow cross. And it is here on this longer line coming from the camera, and this longer line is the clipping distance, but we're not going to talk about today. We're just talking about the focal distance and how it works with Cycles. So you can see here with our camera selected, what you would need to do first if you want to enable this in Cycles is you want to go to display and you want to check limits. Now, if we uncheck limits, it will still render in Cycles with the DOF, but this helps visualize where our focal point is, as well as gives us a rough idea of how blurred things are going to be using some simple math. We're not going to talk about that math here because that's a fairly complex thing. We don't have a lot of time. But we're going to just talk about the setup of this. So when you're in Cycles and you click on a camera, you'll notice that there are these things here. There's focus, there's distance, and then there's something here that by default will say radius, and then there's also f-stop. There's blades and rotation. Now, there's 2 things to note about this part over here. The f-stop and radius are not the same number. They both mean different things, but they directly correlate to how much blur is in your scene. Radius is by default, I don't know why, because radius is usually not used actually in 3D, as radius is never used in real life with cameras either. Usually, if we're going to measure the depth of field, we're going to use the number of f-stop. Now, if you're familiar with cameras, you'll notice here that my number 0.05 is an extremely unrealistic number because there are no lenses in the natural world that actually are able and capable of giving us a 0.05 f-stop. And if you see in rendered, if you know cameras, a 0.05 f-stop should be giving us ridiculous amounts of blur. But because of the size of this scene relative to actual real life sizes, the reason why this number can be slightly inaccurate when it comes to Cycles. That should be fixed, but the way the math works out and the realistic rendering, it really can't be without a lot of modding. So that's a problem you have to keep in mind. A f-stop number here may actually end up being lower than what you would normally have in real life. A normal real life for a lot of blur would be something like 2.4, and then you would go on and up. 22 is usually about the highest you would ever need, although 32 is pretty much a high standard on the low-end Canon commercial cameras. I'm sure you can get higher, and I'm sure there are lenses that do, but going above those actually is pretty bad for the photo after a point. Your usual average landscape photography is taken anywhere between 13 f-stop and 18, so that's also something to keep in mind should you want just a little bit of realistic, camera look to your scene. But we're going to change this to 0.03 to just show you the blur. And now you'll also notice that the blur is pretty grainy, and this is with anything in Cycles, but focal blur takes a lot longer to compute to make it smooth. So you're going to have to run quite a bit more passes on an image than you would without focal blur. But that's something to keep in mind. So as we look down here, there's blades and rotation. Now, rotation for realistic purposes won't necessarily matter. If you're dealing with anything in the blades department less than 10, you will probably want to change the rotation if that's your artistic choice, because the number of blades indicates the look of our blur. So if we had a specific 1 and 0 are both unrealistic blade numbers, because a blade has to be made up of at least 3 blades to be a true aperture in real life. So while we can't see it here, if we were to have a single point of light here and we had blades 3 selected, that light would actually look a bit like a triangle if we let it render long enough, and it wouldn't be grainy anymore. Now, as you go up, this will increase the number of sides that the polygon has. So if we had 7 here, or 8, the triangle would go to an octagon, and then so on and so forth. Now, I find that 15 is a very realistic number, and that's oftentimes what you can use to achieve an accurate result. There's no point in going much higher than that unless your design specifies for it. Now, you also see that's rotation. We've covered that. My focus here, if I don't have a focus, I can specify the distance from the camera to focus on. So that's also something to be aware of. But I'm just using this text object. Normally, if I was doing a professional setup, I would probably use an empty called maybe focus or depth or focus point or something along those lines to control my focus, as I could then animate that focus without having to animate the object it's focused on or animate the object that the camera focuses on. All right, well, that's about everything today. I hope you learned something from this brief cycles tutorial, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.